it was the case that God knows that Cuthbert will freely buy an iguana. Now, what God knows, indeed what he believes, can't be mistaken. It's not possible that he knows something and that something not be true. So, 2, PKC entails C. I should note that there should be actually a double line arrow. The symbol didn't come through apparently when I emailed this paper, and so I think there's a line in the printed collection of papers. The handouts, I think, have the correct arrow, but it should be an arrow indicating entailment. But our antecedent here is absolutely necessary, both because it is eternal and because it is past tense and there is no power over the past. We'll talk in a moment about what this absolute necessity amounts to. For now, though, let's just use an N to represent it. So 3N PKC. But surely, the arguer says, what's entailed by an absolutely necessary truth must itself be absolutely necessary as well. So from 2 and 3, it follows that 4NC, and 4, the arguer says, is clearly incoherent. An action can't be both absolutely necessary and free. So the traditionalist view is incoherent, and we need to reject the claim that God can know future contingent truths. Now, it seems clear that most traditionalists, such as Molina, will accept 1, since to reject it would be, in effect, to reject divine foreknowledge. And it's equally clear that 2 is unlikely to seem problematic to him. Finally, 4 probably would bother him, though until we know just what absolute necessity amounts to, we can't really be sure. So it looks as if, to resist the argument, Molina must say either that 3 is false or that 4 doesn't follow from 2 and 3. And to figure out what to say about either of these moves, of course, we need to know a bit more about the notion of necessity that's being used here. So, just what does absolute necessity amount to? Could it be just standard run-of-the-mill logical or metaphysical necessity? Clearly, that wouldn't be a charitable reading of the argument, since 3 would be all too easy to reject under that interpretation. The incompatibilist then must have some other notion of necessity in mind. And if we look at Molina's response, we get a fairly clear idea of what he at least thinks that notion is. A proposition that is merely contingent if we consider the natures of the terms and the causes or principle from which the joining of the predicate with the subject emanated, at times becomes absolutely necessary because of some condition, a condition that is already actually in it in such a way that its being removed involves a contradiction. Thus, in this sense, even though it was absolutely contingent that Adam existed, for he was freely produced by God, still, by the very fact that he has really existed, his having existed is now, at the present time, necessary in such a way that his not having existed involves a contradiction. For the fact that he existed can no longer be negated or prevented in any way. Pretty clearly, I think, the kind of necessity that's in play in this argument is a kind of temporal modality, the kind that the medievals referred to as necessity per accidens, and that Freddoso fittingly calls accidental necessity. Freddoso, in his discussion of Molina's position, initially explicates the notion via an example. So here's Freddoso. Suppose Susanna played baseball at some past time t. Then the metaphysically contingent state of affairs of Susanna's having played baseball at t is now necessary in such a way that it can no longer be caused not to obtain. And its complement is now impossible in such a way that it can no longer be caused to obtain. Any possible world sharing the same history with our world at the present moment, call it T star, is such that at no time at or after T star in that world can anyone or anything cause it to be false that Susanna played baseball at T, or cause it to be true that she did not play baseball at T. And this is so even if she freely played baseball at T. What's central to something's being accidentally necessary, Freddoso seems to be saying, is its being impervious to current exercises of causal power. It's true, and no one can cause it to be false. Freddoso is evidently echoing Molina here. Recall Molina's speaking of the relevant notion of necessity as applying to truths that can no longer be negated or prevented in any way. It's natural, especially given his repeated claims that we have no power over the past, to read Molina, like Freddoso, as saying that we have no causal power over the relevant past truths, that we cannot prevent or negate them by causing them to be false. Now, though offering a precise characterization of this notion of accidental necessity, of AN, is no easy matter, it will be helpful to employ an initial imprecise characterization. So, roughly, AN1, X is accidentally necessary if and only if X cannot now be caused to be false. Given such an account of AN, it's easy to identify Molina's response to the argument. 3 is true because God knew what Cuthbert will do, and no one has causal power over what God believed. But 4 is false, since Cuthbert can cause C not to be true. So 2 and 3 are true, and 4 is false, so it follows that 2 and 3 don't entail 4. That is, it follows that AN understood along the lines of AN1 isn't closed under entailment. Now, one might think there's a problem with this response. Molina says that 4 is false because Cuthbert can cause C not to be true. But suppose Cuthbert were actually to do so, were to freely refrain from buying the iguana. Wouldn't it still be true that Cuthbert has no power over the past? And so, still true that 3. So had Cuthbert acted in the way Molina says he could, God still would have foreknown that Cuthbert would buy the iguana at T, even though he wouldn't buy the iguana at T. But isn't that incoherent? How can God foreknow that C when not C is true? Molina, of course, would see this alleged conundrum as bogus. Cuthbert can't cause God not to have believed what he in fact believed, because there's no power over the past. But he does have the power to cause it to be the case that C is false. And had he so acted, God never would have believed, let alone known, that C. Some of our contemporaries speak of counterfactual power in this context. There's something that Cuthbert has the power to cause, not C, such that if he were to cause it, then PKC, which in fact is true, never would have been true. The power terminology here might well bother Molina, but the concept is clearly what he would appeal to here. Freddoso offers a more complicated version of the argument, but his conclusion is the same. Molina's response is to deny that AN is closed under entailment, and thus to deny that 4 follows from 2 and 3. Note also that the other classic responses, as characterized by Freddoso, to his more complicated argument can also be presented via Molina's simpler argument. The Aristotelian denies that God or anyone else has knowledge of the contingent future, so 1 is false. The Geachian says that foreknowledge reports only a current tendency of the world, hence 2 is false. Finally, the Occamist, according to Freddoso at least, others may understand Ockhamism differently, maintains that God can exert causal control over his past beliefs, and therefore 3 is false. So, one might think all is right with the philosophical world, at least in the sense that we know where everyone stands. Molinists believe that divine foreknowledge and human freedom are compatible, and they affirm compatibility because Molinists deny that AN is closed under entailment. It's fairly common nowadays to see the Molinist position with respect to arguments for theological fatalism more or less identified in exactly this way. Philosophical amity is so rare a commodity that I hesitate to say that this picture is a distorted one. Having hesitated, I now proceed to say that this picture is a distorted one. It's not that I think that Molina's words have been misquoted or